The rite of adoption was the most sacred ceremony in Kethvari culture. It was older than the Dominion itself, and its rules had been written when the Kethvari were still fighting each other instead of conquering the stars. To complete the rite, a candidate had to pass 3 trials. Each trial tested a different aspect of what the Kethvari considered worthy. The trial of endurance tested the body. The trial of mind tested intelligence and wisdom. The trial of heart tested the soul itself. No human had ever attempted the rite. No human had ever been considered worthy of attempting it. Park Jinho stood before the council chamber, still healing from the wound in his back. Bandages wrapped his chest beneath the simple clothes the Kethvari had given him. High Counselor Vextoth looked at him with open hatred. "This is a mockery," Vextoth declared. "The rite of adoption is meant for Kethvari, warriors of great honor, not for human vermin." Vasari stood beside Jinho with her armor gleaming in the chamber lights. "The old laws do not specify species," she replied calmly. "They specify only that a candidate must be sponsored by a house and must complete the 3 trials. I sponsor this human, and he will face the trials. He will fail." Vextoth predicted with cruel satisfaction. "The trials are designed for Kethvari physiology. A human cannot survive them." Jinho stepped forward before Vetsari could respond. "Then let me fail," he said clearly. "But let me try." The council erupted in murmurs. No candidate had ever spoken directly to them before completing the trials. It was considered disrespectful. But Jinho did not care about Kethvari etiquette. He cared about survival very well. Vextoth said with a thin smile, "Let the human try. Let all of Kethvar Prime witness his failure." The first trial began at dawn the next day. The trial of endurance was held in a great arena on the outskirts of the capital city. Thousands of Kethvari gathered to watch the human attempt what they believed was impossible. The trial was simple in concept. Candidates had to stand in a ring while Kethvari warriors attacked them without weapons. The attacks were not meant to kill, but they were brutal. Candidates had to endure until the judges declared them worthy, or until they fell. Kethvari warriors typically lasted between 2 and 4 hours. The longest recorded endurance was 6 hours by a legendary commander from ancient history. Jinho entered the ring with nothing but the clothes on his back. He was still wounded, and everyone could see it. The first warrior came at him with fists and feet moving in patterns Jinho could not predict. He took hits to his chest and arms and face. He did not try to fight back because fighting back was not the point. The point was to endure. Hour after hour, the warriors came. Fresh attackers replaced tired ones while Jinho had no rest. His body screamed with pain. His vision blurred. Blood ran from cuts on his face, and his wounds opened beneath his bandages. But he did not fall. Human beings had evolved on a world that tried to kill them every day. They had learned to keep going when other species would have stopped. They had learned to ignore pain that should have been overwhelming. They had learned to survive. 7 hours passed. The crowd grew silent as the human continued to stand 8 hours. Jinho could barely see, and his legs shook with exhaustion, but he stood 9 hours. The judges looked at each other with expressions of disbelief. They raised their hands and called an end to the trial. Jinho had endured longer than any Kethvari in recorded history. He collapsed the moment the trial was declared complete. Keth ran to him from the stands and threw her arms around him. "Jinho win," she cried happily. "Jinho win." Jinho managed to smile at her before unconsciousness claimed him. The second trial came 5 days later. After Jinho had recovered enough to walk, the trial of mind was held in the ancient temple at the center of the capital. Candidates were presented with a puzzle that had been created thousands of years ago. The puzzle was different for each candidate, but always impossible to solve through brute force. Only wisdom and creative thinking could find the answer. Jinho was led into a dark chamber where a complex mechanism sat on a stone pedestal. The mechanism was made of interlocking rings and strange symbols. He had to align the rings in the correct pattern to complete the trial. There was no time limit. But every candidate before him had either solved it within one day or given up. Jinho studied the mechanism for hours. He tried different combinations and watched how the rings responded. He noticed patterns that the Kethvari might have overlooked. Because they thought in certain ways humans thought differently. Their minds worked in patterns shaped by a different world and different history. Jinho realized that the puzzle was not meant to be solved by moving the rings in order. It was meant to be solved by moving them all at once. He closed his eyes and visualized the entire mechanism in his mind. Then he moved 12 rings simultaneously in a pattern no Kethvari had ever attempted. The mechanism clicked and opened like a flower blooming. Inside was a single glowing crystal. The judges declared him successful. The crowd outside the temple roared with shock and disbelief. A human had solved the trial of mind in less than 6 hours. The third trial was the most important. The trial of heart had no judges and no audience. Candidates stood alone before the sacred flame in the deepest chamber of the temple. They had to declare what they valued most, and the flame would judge their sincerity. If a candidate lied, the flame would burn cold, and they would fail. If a candidate spoke truth from their soul, the flame would burn bright, and they would pass. Jinho stood before the ancient fire and felt its heat on his face. He thought about what he valued. He thought about his home on Earth and the friends he had lost in the war. He thought about his duty as a soldier and his oath to protect humanity. But when he opened his mouth, different words came out. I value her, he said. I value Catherine. She calls me her warm one because I am hotter than her people. She laughs when I say words wrong in her language. She held my hand when I was afraid, even though she was the one who should have been scared. The flame flickered. Jinho continued speaking. I did not plan to love her. He admitted, I rescued her because it was right. But somewhere along the way she became my daughter in my heart. I would die for her without hesitation. Not because of law or honor or duty. I would die for her because I love her. The flame exploded with light so bright that Jinho had to shield his eyes. When the light faded, the chamber was filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with fire. The trial was complete. The rite of adoption ceremony took place that evening. Vethsari stood before the gathered crowds with Jinho at her side. She spoke the ancient words that bound him to her house. She declared him brother by choice and father to her daughter by law. Catherine stood between them with a smile brighter than any star. Jinho was no longer just Kethbound. He was Kethvari in every way that mattered. High Counselor Vextoth watched from the shadows with fury burning in his eyes. He could not accept this abomination. He would not accept it. That night he gave the order. His loyal forces moved against Vethsari's house. The civil war began with fire and blood and screaming in the streets. Vethsari grabbed Jinho and Catherine and ran for the docking bays. Vextoth has gone mad, she said as explosions echoed behind them. He would rather destroy the Dominion than let a human join a noble house. What do we do? Jinho asked. Vethsari's eyes burned with determination. We run, she said. We gather my loyal ships and we run. Where the war commander looked at him with something like hope. To Earth, she said. I am going to seek alliance with your people. My enemy is now your enemy, and my family is now your family. Jinho held Catherine tight as they boarded Vethsari's ship. The galaxy was burning around them, but they were together, and together they would survive. Vethsari's fleet emerged from hyperspace above Earth 6 months after fleeing. Kethvar primed 12 warships carrying thousands of Kethvari loyalists hung in orbit around the blue and green world. Human defense platforms powered up their weapons, but did not fire. The transmission Vethsari had sent ahead had caused chaos in every government on the planet. A Kethvari war commander wanted to seek alliance. A Kethvari war commander claimed to have a human as part of her family. No one knew what to believe. Admiral Park Dongwook stood on the bridge of the Terran flagship and stared at the alien vessels. He was a stern man who had fought the Kethvari for decades. He had lost friends and ships and pieces of his soul to this endless war. Now he was supposed to negotiate with the enemy. The shuttle from the Void's embrace docked with the Terran flagship. 1 hour later, Admiral Park waited in the landing bay with armed guards at his back. He expected to see alien monsters instead. He saw a tall Kethvari female in black armor, walking beside a human man in strange clothes, and between them, holding both their hands, was a small Kethvari child. The human man looked familiar in a way that made the Admiral's heart stop. Jinho. He whispered. Park Jinho looked at his father for the first time in 5 years. "Hello, father," he said quietly. The Admiral stared at his son with an expression of shock and confusion and something that might have been grief. They had not spoken. Since Jinho chose to become a combat medic instead of following his father into command, the Admiral had called it a waste of talent. Jinho had called it following his heart. Now here they were on opposite sides of an impossible situation. Vethsari stepped forward and bowed her head slightly. "Admiral Park," she said, "I am Vethsari Noxkel. I have come to seek alliance against a common enemy. Your son is part of my house now. He is father to my daughter by sacred law. I hope this truth will help you understand why I am here." The Admiral turned his gaze to the small child standing between his son and the alien commander. Catherine looked up at him with her 4 bright eyes. She did not seem afraid of the stern human with all his guards and weapons. She seemed curious. "Grandfather," she said in careful English. She reached into a pouch at her side and pulled out a small braided cord. "Catherine, make gift for grandfather." The Admiral froze. His guards shifted nervously. Jinho held his breath. The little girl walked forward with the cord held out in her small clawed hands. She stopped in front of the Admiral and looked up at him with innocent hope. "Jinho say grandfather is brave warrior," she said. "Catherine want me brave warrior." Something in Admiral Park Dongwook broke open. He knelt down slowly until he was at eye level with the alien child. He looked at her strange face and her 4 eyes in her small claws. He looked at the gift she had made for him. Then he looked at his son standing beside the Kethvari war commander. He saw the way Jinho watched the child with protective love. He saw the way Vethsari stood close to Jinho like family stands together. He understood. "Thank you," the Admiral said softly. He took the cord from Catherine's hands. "It is beautiful." Catherine smiled, and her bioluminescent markings pulsed with happy colors. "Grandfather-like gift," she said, and clapped her hands together. "Jinho say grandfather would like gift." The Admiral stood and looked at his son. "We have much to discuss," he said. "Yes," Jinho agreed. "We do." The negotiations took 3 days. Human governments argued and debated and demanded proof of Vethsari's intentions. Senator Moon Jie led the peace faction in the Terran Senate, and she spoke passionately in favor of alliance. "This is our chance to end a war that has cost millions of lives," she declared. "The Kethvari are not all our enemies. Some of them want peace as much as we do. We should not waste this opportunity." The alliance was forged on the 4th day. Human and Kethvari forces would combine to face Vextoth as Armada. It was the first joint military operation in the history of both species. Admiral Park Dongwook was given command of the combined fleet. His son served on Vethsari's bridge as a liaison between the 2 forces. The battle above Kethvar Prime was the largest engagement either side had ever seen. Hundreds of ships clashed in the darkness of space. Weapons fire lit up the void like a storm of colored lightning. Vextith's forces were powerful, but they were outnumbered now. The Alliance pushed them back toward the homeworld. Then Vextoth made his final move. His flagship broke through the battle lines and headed straight for the void's embrace. Jinho saw the enemy ship approaching on the tactical display. He saw its weapons powering up. He saw that it was targeting the command deck where Vethsari and Catherine were standing. There was no time to call for help. There was no time to think. Jinho ran for the shuttle bay. He launched his small craft directly at the enemy flagship. The shuttle was tiny compared to the massive warship, but its engines were fast, and Jinho aimed for the weapons array that was about to fire. The collision was violent and bright. Jinho's shuttle slammed into the enemy weapons and exploded. The array was destroyed seconds before it could fire on Void's embrace. Vethsari's voice screamed through the communication system. Jinho. The battle continued for another hour. Without its main weapons, Vextev's flagship was vulnerable human and Kethvari. Fighters swarmed it from every direction. The High Counselor died when his ship broke apart. The war ended with his death, but Jinho floated in the wreckage of his shuttle barely alive. His suit had protected him from the vacuum, but the impact had broken most of his bones. Kethvari rescue teams reached him first. They pulled him from the debris and rushed him to medical care. He did not wake up for 3 weeks when Jinho finally opened his eyes. He was in a medical bay filled with soft light. Something warm was pressed against his side. He looked down and saw Catherine curled against him with her small claws gripping his hospital gown. She was bigger than he remembered. 6 months of growth had changed her from a small child into a young girl, but she still held on to him the same way she had since the beginning. Vethsari sat in a chair beside the bed. Her eyes were tired, and there were lines on her face that had not been there before. She looked at Jinho with an expression of relief. So deep it was almost painful. "You survived," she said. "You always survive." "Sorry." Jinho managed to whisper, "I keep causing trouble." Vethsari laughed. It was the first time Jinho had ever heard her laugh. "You crashed a shuttle into an enemy flagship to save my daughter and me," she said. "That is not trouble. That is family." Jinho smiled weakly. "How long was I unconscious?" 3 weeks. Vethsari leaned closer. "The war is over. Vextov is dead, and his faction has surrendered. The alliance between our peoples is holding, and it is all because of you, not just me," Jinho said. He touched Catherine's sleeping head gently. "Because of her too. Because a scared little girl in a basement taught me that enemies are just people we do not understand yet." Vethsari was quiet for a moment. "You asked me once when I would release you from your bond," she said. Jinho remembered. It had been months ago on the Void's embrace when he first became Kethbound. "I remember," he said. Vethsari stood and moved to the side of his bed. She looked down at him with her 4 burning eyes. "Never," she said. "You are my family. You are her father. You are ours, Park Jinho. And we do not let go of what is ours." Jinho looked at the sleeping child against his side. He looked at the Kethvari warrior who had become his sister. He thought about everything he had lost and everything he had gained. "I do not want you to," he said. 3 years later, Ambassador Park Jinho addressed the first joint Human Kethvari Council. He stood at a podium in a great hall filled with representatives from both species. Beside him stood War Commander Vethsari, Noxkel his sister, by law and choice. Behind them, a banner displayed the symbol of the alliance, 2 hands reaching toward each other across the stars. In the front row sat a young Kethvari woman with 4 bright eyes. Beside her was an elderly human man wearing a braided cord around his wrist. Admiral Park Dongwook smiled at his granddaughter. Catherine smiled back. She was the child who had bridged 2 worlds. She was the daughter of a human father and a Kethvari mother. She was proof that enemies could become family. Jinho finished his speech, and the hall erupted in applause. He walked down from the podium, and Catherine ran to meet him. She was too big to carry now, but she still hugged him the same way she always had. "I am proud of you, father," she said. Jinho held her tight. "I am proud of you too," he replied, "my warm one." Vethsari joined them and placed a hand on each of their shoulders. "What now?" she asked. Jinho looked out at the crowd of humans and Kethvari celebrating together. He thought about the future they were building. He thought about all the impossible things that had already happened. Now we see what comes next," he said. Together, Catherine took his hand on one side and Vethsari's hand on the other. Together, she agreed, and together they walked toward whatever the stars had waiting for them. Life on the Void's embrace was unlike anything Park Jin-ho had ever experienced. He was not a prisoner, but he was not free either. The Kethvari called him Kethbound, which meant his life belonged to Vethsari until she chose to release him. He did not know if that release would ever come. The old laws were ancient traditions that even the war commander could not ignore. To free someone who was Kethbound required the completion of certain rituals and conditions. Vethsari had not explained what those conditions were. Perhaps she did not intend to explain them at all. Jin-ho was given quarters near Vethsari's own chambers. They were small but comfortable, and they had a window that looked out at the stars. He spent hours staring at that window and wondering what was happening back home. The human diplomatic corps sent angry messages demanding his return. Jin-ho learned this from Elder Sormveth, who visited him on the third day. The elder was Vethsari's father, and he looked at Jin-ho with undisguised contempt. "The humans claim we have taken you prisoner," Sormveth said. "They threaten retaliation if you are not released." "And what does the war commander say?" Jin-ho asked. "She says you are not a prisoner." The elder's voice dripped with disapproval. "She says you are Kethbound, and that is different." "Is it?" Sormveth leaned closer, and his four eyes narrowed. "Do not think you are special human," he warned. "You saved my granddaughter, and for that I will not kill you. But you are still vermin to me and to most of our people. The old laws protect you, but protection is not the same as acceptance." Jin-ho met the elder's gaze without flinching. "I did not ask to be here," he said calmly. "I saved a child because it was the right thing to do. What happens now is not my choice." Something flickered in Sormveth's expression. It might have been surprise, or perhaps a tiny grain of respect. He left without another word. The days that followed fell into a strange routine. Jin-ho was assigned a guard named Rethkai, who followed him everywhere. Rethkai was young for a Kethvari warrior, and his hatred for humans was obvious in every look and gesture. He never spoke to Jin-ho directly, and he kept his hand near his weapon at all times. But Catherine did not share the hatred of her people. The little girl visited Jin-ho every day, and she brought gifts and stories and endless questions. She taught him words in her language and laughed when he pronounced them wrong. She called him her warm one, because human body temperature was higher than Kethvari Jin-ho warm. She would say, and press her small hands against his cheeks, "Catherine, like warm." Jin-ho found himself smiling at her antics despite everything. She was curious and brave and full of life. She reminded him why he had saved her in the first place. Vethsari watched these interactions from a distance. Jin-ho often caught her observing them from doorways or across rooms. Her expression was always unreadable. He did not know what she was thinking, and she never told him. The Kethvari fleet eventually left orbit around Veltri 7 and jumped to hyperspace. Jin-ho watched the moon disappear through his window and felt a strange mix of loss and relief. His old life was gone now. Whatever came next would be something completely new. 3 weeks after leaving the war zone, the fleet arrived at Kethvar Prime. The Dominion homeworld was beautiful in a harsh alien way. Its surface was covered with dark forests and deep oceans that glowed with bioluminescence. Cities rose from the landscape like mountains of metal and light. Jin-ho was brought before the Dominion Council to be examined like a curiosity. The council members looked at him with expressions ranging from disgust to fascination. They argued about what should be done with him. Some demanded his execution. Others wanted to use him as leverage against the humans. High Counselor Vextuth was the loudest voice calling for Jin-ho's death. "This human is a spy," Vextuth declared. "The war commander has been deceived by his false kindness. We should kill him and send his body back to Earth as a message." Vethsari stood before the council and defended her decision. "The humans saved my daughter's life. she said firmly. The old laws are clear on such matters. He is Keth-bound to my house, and only I can decide his fate. The old laws are relics. Vextoth spat. They have no place in modern war. The old laws are what make us Kethvari. Vethsari replied coldly. Would you abandon our traditions for the sake of killing one human? The argument continued for hours. In the end, the council could not override the old laws. Jinho remained bound to Vethsari's house, but his position was fragile, and he knew it. Enemies surrounded him on all sides. 1 month after arriving on Kethvar Prime, an assassin came for Catherine. Jinho was with the child in the gardens when it happened. They were looking at strange flowers that glowed in the evening. Darkness, Catherine was telling him their names in her language when Jinho noticed movement in the shadows. His combat training kicked in before his conscious mind understood the danger. He grabbed Catherine and threw himself over her body. The blade, meant for the child, buried itself in his back. Instead, pain exploded through him like fire. He heard Catherine scream and felt her small hands pressing against his face. Then Rethkai was there with his weapon drawn. The young guard killed the assassin. With a single precise strike, other warriors arrived seconds later, and the garden filled with shouting and chaos. Jinho felt himself being lifted. He looked up and saw Vethsari's face above him. Her 4 eyes were wide with an emotion he had never seen in her before. Human. She said urgently, Jinho, stay awake. Catherine. Jinho managed to whisper, is she safe? She is safe. Vethsari's voice cracked. You saved her again. Jinho tried to smile, but the darkness was pulling at him. Good, he said. That is good. He lost consciousness before he could say anything more. When Jinho woke, he was in a medical chamber surrounded by Kethvari healers. Catherine was curled against his side, with her small claws gripping his hospital gown. Vethsari sat in a chair nearby, and she was watching him with those unreadable eyes. You should have died, she said when she saw he was awake. The blade pierced your lung. Sorry to disappoint, Jinho replied weakly. Vethsari did not smile, but something in her expression softened. My daughter told me you threw yourself over her without hesitation. She said you did not even make a sound when the blade struck. Jinho looked down at the sleeping child. She was in danger. He said simply, there was no time to think. You could have let her die. Vethsari's voice was strange. You could have let the assassin kill her, and then claimed you could not save her. No one would have blamed you. I would have blamed me. Jinho said quietly. Vethsari stood and walked to his bedside. She reached down and touched his face with one clawed hand. Her skin was cool against his fevered cheek. The assassin was sent by Counselor Vextoth, she said. I cannot prove it, but I know it is true. He wants to destroy my house, and killing my daughter would have broken me. Instead, you nearly died protecting her. Jinho met her 4 burning eyes. What happens now? He asked. Vethsari's expression became something fierce and determined. Now I invoke the right of adoption, she declared. You will not merely be bound to my house. You will become part of it. You will be Catherine's father by our law. And no one will be able to touch you without declaring war on everything I hold sacred. Jinho stared at her. I do not understand, he said. You will. Vethsari promised. Rest now, human. The trials ahead will require all of your strength. She turned and walked away. Catherine stirred against. Jinho sighed and looked up at him with sleepy eyes. Jinho okay? She asked. Jinho touched her head gently. Jinho okay? He confirmed. Go back to sleep, little one. Catherine smiled and closed her eyes. Jinho stared at the ceiling and wondered what he had gotten himself into. The war commander wanted to make him family. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, he felt something strange and unexpected. He felt hope. The battle for Outpost Sigma ended when the first sun rose over the moon of Veltri 7. Corporal Park. Jinho stood among the ruins and watched smoke rise from broken buildings all around him. 3 years of war against the Kethvari Dominion had taught him what victory looked like. It looked like death and dust and silence where there should be life. His squad moved through the destroyed streets with weapons ready. The Kethvari forces had retreated, but everyone knew they could return at any moment. Sergeant Yu Mirai gave orders with sharp hand signals, and the soldiers spread out to search for survivors. Jinho was a combat medic. His job was to find the wounded and keep them alive until help arrived. He had saved 17 human lives in the past 3 days of fighting. He had also watched 9 friends die because he could not reach them in time. The weight of those losses sat heavy on his chest as he walked through the rubble. He checked each collapsed building carefully. Most held only the dead human and Kethvari bodies lay together in the wreckage, and Jinho tried not to look at their faces. A sound stopped him near the basement of what had once been a storage facility. It was faint and high, and it made him think of a wounded animal. He stood very still and listened. The sound came again from somewhere below the broken concrete. Protocol said he should mark the location and call for backup. Protocol said he should not enter unstable structures alone. Protocol said many things that Jinho decided to ignore. He climbed down through a gap in the floor and dropped into darkness. His flashlight cut through the dust and shadows. The basement was full of fallen beams and shattered equipment, and there in the darkest edifice, corner trapped beneath a heavy metal support, was a Kethvari child. Jinho froze. He had never seen a Kethvari youngling before. The child was small with 4 eyes that reflected his light like mirrors in the dark. Bioluminescent markings covered its gray skin, and they pulsed with a rhythm that spoke of pure terror. The Kethvari had killed so many humans. Their warriors showed no mercy to soldiers or civilians. Jinho had watched them execute prisoners without hesitation. Every part of his training screamed at him to walk away and leave this enemy child to die. But then the youngling made that sound again. It was not a word in any language. Jinho knew it was simply fear given voice. And Jinho could not walk away from fear like that. He moved slowly toward the child, with his hands open and empty. The youngling tried to pull away, but the beam held it trapped. One of its thin arms was bent at a wrong angle, and dark blood pooled beneath its body. "I am not going to hurt you," Jinho said quietly. He knew the child could not understand his words, but he hoped his tone would carry meaning. He set down his weapon and pulled his medical kit from his pack. The beam was heavy, but not impossible to move. Jinho found it broken pipe and used it as a lever. He pushed and strained and felt his muscles burn with effort. The metal groaned and shifted, and inch by inch the weight lifted off the small body. The child did not run when it was free. Perhaps it was too weak or too scared. It simply lay there and watched Jinho with all 4 of its trembling eyes. Jinho worked carefully to treat its wounds. He set the broken arm using a splint from his kit. He cleaned the cuts on its torso and wrapped them with bandages meant for human skin. The child flinched at first, but then grew still. It watched his hands move with something like wonder. "There," Jinho said when he finished. "You are going to be okay." The child made a soft clicking sound that might have been a question. Jinho smiled even though he knew the expression meant nothing to this alien species. "My name is Jinho," he said and pointed to himself. "Jinho." The child stared at him for a long moment. Then it raised one small clawed hand and touched his chest. "Jinho." It repeated in a voice like wind through hollow reeds. Jinho felt something shift inside him. This was not an enemy. This was just a child who was scared and hurt and alone. He picked up the youngling gently and held it against his chest. It weighed almost nothing. Its small claws gripped his uniform, and it pressed its face against his shoulder. Jinho climbed out of the basement and walked back toward the human base. He knew there would be consequences. He knew his commanders would not understand. But he also knew he could not leave this child to die in the dark. Sergeant Yoon found him halfway to the base. She took one look at the bundle in his arms, and her face went pale with anger. "What have you done?" she demanded. I found a survivor, Jinho said calmly. That is not a survivor, Yoon snapped. That is the enemy. It is a child. Jinho held the youngling tighter as it trembled at the loud voices. It is a HFY child. Yoon said, do you know what they would do if they found one of our children? Yes, Jinho admitted, and I do not want to be like them. Yoon stared at him for a long moment. Something in her expression shifted, but she did not soften. Colonel Bay will hear about this, she said. Then let her hear, Jinho replied. He walked past his sergeant and continued toward the base. The other soldiers stopped and stared as he carried the HFY child through the gates. Some looked at him with disgust. Others looked confused. A few looked at the small trembling form in his arms, and their expressions became something harder to read. Colonel Bae-sun met him at the medical center. She was a practical woman who had commanded this outpost through 3 years of brutal war. Her face showed no emotion as she looked at the child. Explain, she said. Jinho told her everything. He told her about the sound in the basement and the fear in the child's eyes and the choice he had made. Colonel Bay listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. You have created a problem, she finally said. I saved a life, Jinho replied. You saved an enemy life, Bay corrected. In war, that is a problem. She turned to leave but stopped at the door. The child stays in medical isolation, she ordered. You will care for it until we decide what to do. Yes, Colonel. Jinho spent the next 3 days at the child's side. He fed it and changed its bandages and sat with it. When nightmares made it cry out, the youngling learned to trust him slowly. It followed him with its eyes. Whenever he moved, it gripped his finger with its small claws when it was afraid. On the 3rd day, it spoke its first word to him, Catherine. It said and touched its own chest. Jinho smiled and touched the child's hand. Catherine, he repeated. That is a beautiful name. The child made a sound that might have been laughter. That same night, Colonel Bay called Jinho to the command center. Her face was grim. We intercepted a HFY transmission, she said. They are looking for a child lost in the battle. Jinho felt his stomach tighten. What kind of child? Bay pulled up the transmission on her screen. HFY voice filled the room, harsh and demanding. Even without understanding the words, Jinho could hear the desperate fury behind them. That voice belongs to Vethsari Noxkel, Bay said quietly, war commander of the HFY 3rd Fleet. Jinho looked down at the sleeping child in the next room. The child I rescued, he said. Yes, Bay confirmed. You saved the daughter of one of the most dangerous HFY alive. The weight of those words settled over Jinho like a heavy blanket. He had made a simple choice to save a frightened child. Now the choice would change everything. The HFY 3rd Fleet dropped out of hyperspace above Veltri 7 like a storm appearing from clear sky. 20 warships hung in orbit, and their weapons pointed down at the small human outpost below Corporal Park. Jinho stood at the window of the medical center and watched the lights of the fleet grow brighter. Little Catherine pressed against his leg, and her 4 eyes reflected the ships above. She knew those were her people. She also knew she was afraid. Colonel Bay's voice echoed through every speaker on the base. All personnel to battle stations. But everyone understood that battle stations would not save them. 20 ships against 1 damaged outpost was not a fight. It was an execution waiting to happen. The communication array crackled with an incoming transmission. A voice filled the command center, and it carried more authority than anything Jinho had ever heard. I am Vethsari Noxkel. The voice declared, War Commander of the 3rd Fleet and Blade of the Dominion. You have something that belongs to me. Return my daughter within 1 solar cycle, or I will reduce your outpost to ash and scatter your remains across this worthless moon. The transmission ended. Silence filled the base like water filling a sinking ship. Colonel Bay called an emergency meeting of all senior officers. Jinho was not senior, but he was summoned anyway. He brought Catherine with him because she would not let go of his hand. The officers stared at the small alien child with expressions that ranged from hatred to confusion to something that might have been pity. "The tactical choice is clear," said Lieutenant Commander Wang. "We return the child and hope they leave. And if they do not leave," Sergeant Yoon asked. "Then we die," Wang replied. "But at least we die having tried diplomacy." "Diplomacy?" Another officer scoffed. "The Cathvari do not know that word." Arguments erupted around the table. Some wanted to fight. Others wanted to surrender the child immediately. A few suggested using Catherine as a hostage to negotiate their own escape. Jinho listened to them talk about the little girl like she was cargo to be traded. His grip on her hand tightened. "I will take her," he said. The room fell silent. "Excuse me," Colonel Bay asked. "I will take Catherine to her mother myself." Jinho repeated, "Under flag of truce." "That is suicide," Yoon said. "Probably," Jinho agreed. "But I am the one who rescued her, and I should be the one to return her. The Cathvari will kill you the moment you step off the shuttle." Wang warned Jinho looked down at Catherine. She did not understand the words, but she sensed the tension. Her small claws dug into his palm. "Maybe," he said, "but she trusts me and I will not hand her over to strangers who see her as a bargaining chip." Colonel Bay studied him for a long moment. "You understand that if you do this, we cannot protect you." "I understand. And you still want to go." Jinho knelt down to meet Catherine's 4 eyes. "Catherine," he said gently, "I'm going to take you to your mother." The child tilted her head. "Mother," she repeated in her soft, clicking voice. "Yes." Jinho touched her face. "She is waiting for you." Catherine looked up at the lights in the sky. Then she looked back at Jinho and wrapped her thin arms around his neck. "Jinho, come too," she said. "Yes." He promised. "Jinho comes too." The shuttle launched 1 hour later. Jinho sat in the pilot's seat with Catherine strapped into the seat beside him. A white flag of truce was painted on every surface of the small craft. He did not know if the Cathvari would honor it. Human forces and Cathvari forces had not exchanged prisoners or held negotiations in over 2 years. This could be the moment that changed everything. Or it could be the moment Jinho died. The flagship grew larger in his viewport as he approached. It was called the Void's Embrace, and it was the largest warship Jinho had ever seen. Its hull was dark and covered with patterns that glowed like the bioluminescent marks on Cathvari skin, weapons tracked his shuttle, but they did not fire. A docking bay opened like a mouth in the side of the great ship. Jinho flew inside. The bay was full of Cathvari warriors. Hundreds of them stood in perfect formation with weapons drawn and eyes fixed on the human shuttle. Jinho took a deep breath and opened the hatch. He stepped out first with his hands raised and empty. Then he turned and helped Catherine down from the shuttle. The child stood beside him and looked around at her people with wide, wondering eyes. A path opened through the warriors. At the end of that path stood a figure that radiated power and fury. Vethsari Noxkel was tall even for a Cathvari. Her armor was black and decorated with symbols of rank that Jinho did not recognize her. 4 eyes burned with an intensity that made Jinho want to run. But he did not run. He walked forward with Catherine's hand in his. They stopped 10 paces from the war commander. Jinho bowed his head in respect. "I return your daughter to you," he said. "She was wounded in the battle, but I treated her injuries, and she is healthy now." Vethsari did not move. Her eyes shifted from Jinho to the child, and something in her expression cracked. "Catherine," she said. Her voice was soft now and filled with emotion. "Mother." Catherine cried. She released Jinho's hand and ran to the war commander. Vethsari caught her daughter and lifted her into her arms. She held the child tight and her whole body trembled. Jinho watched the reunion and felt a strange peace settle over him. Whatever happened next, he had done the right thing. Vethsari pressed her face against her daughter's head and spoke words in her own language. Catherine answered in a mix of Cathvari and the few human words she had learned. Then the child pointed at Jinho. Jinho, she said clearly. Jinho saved Catherine. Every Kethvari in the bay turned to look at the human. Vethsari raised her head, and her burning eyes fixed on Jinho once more. She set her daughter down gently and walked toward him. Each step echoed in the silent bay. Jinho stood his ground, even though every instinct screamed at him to flee. The war commander stopped directly in front of him. She was so close he could see his own reflection in her 4 dark eyes. "You saved my daughter," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Jinho confirmed. "Why?" The question hung in the air. Jinho thought about all the reasons he could give. He could talk about mercy or compassion or the rules of war. But in the end, there was only one truth. Because she was afraid and alone. He said, "And no child deserves to die like that." Vethsari stared at him. Jinho could not read the emotion on her alien face. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Then the war commander spoke words that froze every Kethvari in the bay. "This human belongs to my house now." Shocked murmurs rippled through the warriors. "He saved what is most precious to me." Vethsari continued, "By the old laws, his life is bound to mine until I release him." Jinho did not understand what those words meant, but he understood that he was not going home. Catherine walked back to him and took his hand again. She looked up at him with her 4 bright eyes. "Jinho, stay," she said happily. "Jinho, stay with Catherine." Jinho looked at the little girl. Then he looked at the war commander, who had just claimed his life. He was trapped on an enemy ship surrounded by aliens who had killed his friends, and somehow the child. Holding his hand made him feel less afraid. "It seems I am staying," he said quietly. Vethsari nodded once. "Yes, human," she replied. "You are."